main conditions with another 175 that were actually found dead. Okay, so let's look at the actual details, and it appears actually that many of them do add up. So let's go to the NBC News report. So the NBC News report specifically did not they did not describe the origin and the connections to the Chinese Communist Party in this, but they do actually confirm something key. One, this was an illegal, unlicensed laboratory full of lab mice, full of medical waste, and full of hazardous material. The Fresno County Public Health Department, quote, evaluated and assessed the activities of this unlicensed lab, and what they found is that with multiple state and federal agencies determined biological and chemical contents that were actually on site, including coronavirus, HIV, hepatitis, and herpes. So they actually confirmed, some of the actual chemicals and the biological strains and many of the others that were present there on site. Then you have to go down like a bit of a deeper rabbit hole here. And this was a fascinating view actually from public local news. This is why we do still need local news, Bristol, because they have great investigations. Let's put this up there. They say, quote, I have never seen anything like this. Illegal medical lab discovered in Reedley. This is from yourcentralvalley.com. What they point to is the city manager, actually, of the property, says that she's never seen this in her 26-year career in the county of Fresno, with 800 different types of chemicals and all of that, which were on site. But eventually, what comes through is that the tenant was a company called Prestige Biotech, and this is now since been confirmed, that was registered in Nevada, but was actually unlicensed for business in California. So the company's president is a Chinese citizen who they were only able to speak with via emails, which were actually included in the court documents. And, quote, other addresses provided as authorized agents for these FD offices were addresses in China that could not then be verified. Also, agents found thousands of package boxes, many with shipping labels from China, which were included in the court documents. So what was this lab doing in Fresno County, California? What's happening with this? And the craziest part, nobody knows. Right? Who is this company? Who is this Chinese guy? How did they get a permit for all this stuff? Did it come through legally or illegally in customs? And then what were they studying in this? So this is one of the most bizarre, odd things that has happened. There's obviously a lot of skepticism and allegation and discussion around Wuhan, but at least that one was level 4 safety biolab run by the Chinese government. This is some sketchy company in the middle of Fresno doing God knows what, who knows kind of unregulated chemicals. And the why question has still yet to be answered, despite multiple people in California trying to get to the bottom. Yeah. From what I could read in the court documents.
It's a wild story. And the authorities just sort of stumbled upon this.
Yeah, exactly.
City inspectors saw a garden hose that was like a piece of garden hose was supposed to be, which I didn't really know that they regulated where garden hoses could be, but apparently
probably in industrial areas.
Building, they were like, you can't have that garden hose there. What else is going on? And then they go into this supposedly empty warehouse building and find all of this crazy stuff. In terms of what the owner of this company, Prestige Biotech, is saying, he told officials that Prestige Biotech moved assets that belonged to a defunct company called Universal Meditech Inc. to that warehouse from Fresno after that other company went under. Prestige Biotech was a creditor to that other company and identified as its successor, according to court documents. Officials were unable to get any California-based address for either company except for the previous Fresno location from which UMI had been evicted. So basically the story from the owner of this sketchy biotech company is that they had acquired this other defunct biotech company, that these were the assets that one, and they just were sort of like storing them there randomly. Is basically
it's a Mercedes-Benz.
I mean,
Fuck them.
Like live mice included in this? I don't know. It is a wild one. I have no idea what's going on with this, but it is really weird.
I mean, I think what has kind of come through is that clearly, I mean, the thing is too, is that the pictures, like you can see, can we throw the first one up there just so people get an idea? I mean, I would have believed if they had told me that it was like a meth
What
lab or some
happened
sort
to
of
the
drug lab.
San
As
Mal
you can see
people?
from- I mean, it's filthy.
Do they?
There's
Are they
stuff
not
everywhere.
around
Clearly,
anymore?
it's not clean.
Gloves
There's
hanging out
gloves
there.
hanging out, beakers and all that. I mean, it genuinely does look like it could,
No,
come out
babies
of
are
a drug
gross,
den.
babies are gross, babies are gross,
And
babies are
yet
gross,
you
babies
find
are
out
gross,
that we're
babies are
talking
gross,
about like
babies are gross.
viral agents, infectious bacterial, filthy mice in conditions, and then the
Babies are
the
fucking
why
gross.
question is the one that just continues
Eh.
to abound from all of this. So yeah, like you said,
Mm.
they stumbled across it somehow. I mean, what's really actually kind of terrifying to me is like customs, because allegedly we are supposed to have very stringent regulation on chemical agents, viral agents, bacteria, and all the stuff that comes into the United States, and it's especially supposed to be very high on China. Now the problem is that China makes the vast majority of inputs for a lot of drugs, but they do come in by a relatively regulated process. One of the reasons why they were supposed to look very hard at the unregulated market is that Chinese fentanyl is probably responsible for the vast majority of opioid deaths here in the United States. And that's the reason why the drug cartels, they don't make those drugs here in America, they make it in Mexico, where the export control is much more corrupt, effectively, in order to get it into the country. That's the whole point. So then my question is like, well, how the hell did they even get this?
Well, but we don't necessarily know that it came from, that the materials came from
Well,
China.
the shipping boxes came from China. So, I mean, yeah, you're right. Maybe they shipped it to Mexico and they drove it across the border. I mean,
We have no idea where this stuff was acquired from whatsoever. I mean, that could be too, that it was shipped. We just don't know. And the thing to me that doesn't pass no test about the story that this was, they're basically just storing this stuff here after this other company went defunct or whatever. When you look at those pictures, I mean, this isn't just like things in storage boxes. You've got a whole lab set up there. You've got the gloves there. You've got things in beakers. You've got stuff that's on the table. I don't know. It doesn't look like you were just like, oh, let me put it in storage and then, I don't know, dispose of it somehow, do something with it. It's a weird one.
And also the, creating front companies and all that in order to justify legal export and import. That's a time-honored kind of Chinese tradition. I've read and done some dives into Chinese fentanyl business. It's almost exactly the same in terms of like, oh, you have a defunct company, a fake address in China, and whenever you're trying to, trace it back and be like, where did this come from?
It's not a Chinese-specific phenomenon.
Yeah,
It's what sketchy businessmen do all around the world, including here in the good old U.S. of A.
Maybe they probably stole it from. They probably stole the tactic from us. So don't ever let anyone say they didn't steal the best.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.
Of the illegal biological COVID lab discovered in Reedley in March of this year. It's first important to remember what this community, our nation, the world went through for the last 3 years. The COVID pandemic went on for nearly 3 years. It's commonly believed that COVID resulted from a lab leak out of the Wuhan lab in China. Worldwide, there are 769 million cases of COVID that resulted in nearly 7 million deaths. In the United States, there have been 107 million cases and nearly 1.2 million deaths. In California, there have been 103,000 deaths. China's COVID-19 virus resulted in the destruction of lives, livelihoods, the economy, and business. Children were stupidly locked out of school for 2 years and were destroyed academically, socially, and emotionally. People lost their freedom, were forced to get experimental vaccines, to wear ineffective masks, and were lied to over and over by the CDC and government officials. Any information that challenged the lies, tyrannical mandates that were suppressed by social media. And we had officials locally that were silent and complicit with all the unconstitutional and destructive government orders. And now they're silent again. So what do we know about this lab in Reedley? Well, on March 3rd, the Reedley code enforcement officers investigated the site after seeing an illegally attached garden hose. On March 16th, the warehouse was inspected, and it was discovered that the lab was producing COVID-19. There is blood, tissue, bodily fluid samples, thousands of vials with fluids that are not labeled. They also found 900 mice, 200 mice that were dead. On March 16th, the representative from the company, Prestige Biotech, potentially a China national, informed investigators, quote, "These mice were genetically engineered to catch and carry the COVID-19 virus," end quote. Prestige Biotech, that company, is licensed in Nevada, not California. One address listed for this company is a vacant building in Las Vegas. Substack reports that other addresses related to this company appear to be in China, so this can't be verified at this time.
God.
And they also report that, quote, "thousands of packages were found
Oh,
as
Bobby.
well. Many were shipping
Claro.
labels from China," end quote.
Yeah, I see
May
a big
4th,
boy.
The CDC inspected the lab, found
I
infectious
know.
agents that were both bacterial
Yes, we will go.
and viral in nature. Some of these include hepatitis B, C, rubella, malaria, E. coli, and pneumonia.
Mhm.
Fresno Superior Court documents indicate
Yes,
that mice were involved in these experiments
Oh.
with COVID-19. The
Come on.
lab apparently illegally disposed of medical waste,
Come on.
and it's believed it went to the landfill. This can't be confirmed because the operators of the lab have not been forthcoming. Now, questions that must be answered that the public has a right to know. One, is this company from China? Or is it sponsored by the Chinese government? What was the purpose and goals of their experimenting with COVID-19 and having mice catch and carry the disease? What were they doing with all the bacterial and viral infectious agents found at the illegal lab? Two, are the people that were running and operating this lab Chinese nationals or American citizens? If they're not American citizens, are they here illegally?
Standing.
Three, and most
Please.
importantly, why wasn't the public
Oh,
informed of this illegal lab and what was found?
Yeah,
The
baby.
Fresno County Department
I
of
know.
Public Health
Mm.
has an obligation to notify the public of potential dangers, both past
Oh,
and present.
fuck.
During the COVID pandemic, their medical officer held weekly press conferences testifying to ineffective, destructive lockdowns
Wow.
and mandates, and yet not even an acknowledgement to the
Oh,
public
baby.
of the illegal and potentially dangerous activities of the lab. So he spent a week having the media come, telling the public things that were not true, supporting all of the tyrannical, destructive things that were taking place in our city, our county, our state, our nation. And then when a lab related to COVID-19 is found 5 months ago, no word. No word from him, no word from the Public Health Department, no word from the Board of Supervisors. Number 4, the Board of Supervisors are also silent. This is similar to the crisis when foster children were found to be sleeping on floors in offices. They only addressed it when they were forced to because it became public through the media. This is disgraceful and represents a willful decision to hide from and shirk their duties as elected representatives of, guess what? The public. They're responsible to the public. These same Board of Supervisors were derelict in responsibilities to the public during the pandemic. They were silent, complicit with all of Governor Newsom's destructive, unscientific lockdowns, mandates, and forcing kids out of school for 2 years. Now we have the same cowardice from the Board of Supervisors, and their silence again when facing another crisis in the county, again related to COVID. The public has a right to know what did the Board of Supervisors know about the lab, when did they know it, and why didn't they inform the public? 5, are there any current potential dangers to the public as a result of these experiments and illegal dumping of medical waste that involve COVID-19 and potential infectious agents that are both bacterial and viral in nature? Are there any potential adverse impacts to the farms in the area? How about the people in Fresno County or even beyond the local area? We know COVID spread around the world. How can the public be assured no medical waste was disposed of in our water systems? Number 6, were any safety measures in place at this illegal lab to protect the public from spread of COVID or the infectious agents they were experimenting with? We believe COVID spread from the Wuhan lab, and it could have come from this lab as well. Number 7, Lemoore Naval Air Station is only 45 miles from this illegal lab. As was reported in Substack, quote, all of the F-18s for all the Navy's West Coast base carriers are located at Lemoore. The F-18s are primary strike fighters for the United States Navy. In a war with China, these are the aircraft that we would rely upon to sink Chinese naval vessels and give us victory, end quote. The implications from the spread of a debilitating virus could be devastating to our nation's military readiness. Is the location of this illegal lab coincidence or purposeful? Now, what do we do with what we've got right now? Well, according to Joe Prado of the Fresno County Department of Health, there's currently no requirements for any lab, licensed or not, to report to the local public health department the biologicals or the testing that's being conducted. I call on the Board of Supervisors to immediately create a new law mandating this requirement in Fresno County, with the penalty of immediate shutdown if the lab is non-compliant. Additionally, there should be financial and criminal penalties for non-compliance. Secondly, Mr. Prado also stated, quote, if you don't receive public funding of any sort, you can, with private dollars, set up a laboratory in California and the United States, end quote, just like was done here. This must change on the state and the national level. There must be enough oversight to protect the public. This clearly isn't the case now. It must change immediately. And lastly, I don't know when elected officials will learn who they work for. It's for the public. The public has a right to know that after March 3rd, 5 months ago, an illegal lab experimenting with mice with COVID-19 infectious agents, similarly as was done at the Wuhan lab 3 years ago, is going on in our backyard. The public has a right to know. The public has a right to know exactly what they know and when they knew it and what they intend to do about what's going on. Secondly, are there any other labs like this floating around? And what is happening with the people who were involved in this lab? These are the questions that I've been asked by the public. These are the questions that should be answered by the public. The Fresno Board of Supervisors and the County Public Department of Health, Public Health, has an obligation to let people know what's going on. I'll be happy to answer your question. Well, there's no connection other than I represent the public. The public is asking me, Gary, can you get involved and find out what's going on? And so we've done that. And that's what we've done. They know darn well that I'm their voice, that I always have been a voice for people. And just like during COVID-19 with all of the tyrannical, authoritarian, unscientific, destructive lockdowns that I opposed, they know where I stand on things. You have to have transparency in government. And it just is lacking. And it's lacking here. And it's unbelievable that we've just gone through COVID for 3 years, where millions of people lost their lives under similar circumstances for people who were experimenting in China, and a virus was unleashed upon the world. Whether it was intentional or not, we don't know. The fact is, the virus was unleashed on the world in similar ways, experimenting with COVID-19, and then it left that lab and died. That's something we have to look at. I'm not aware. I mean, this is the first I heard about this in July 25th when it was reported in the local media paper here in Greenwood. It's the first I've heard of any kind of lab like this anywhere. So that's something I'm sure the city of Fresno will look at and determine are any lab like this operating anywhere, and if so, what's going on. Hopefully, they don't. Sorry. Well, when you have a business, you're supposed to have a business permit, and people are supposed to provide that business permit and pay for that permit. That's what the city knows businesses that are operating in the city. Now, if there are labs, as Mr. Prado says, and they're private, they don't have to register with any that's a problem. And that's a problem on a national and state level as well as a local level. We, the city of Fresno, will certainly be doing our due diligence. This situation, looking at any relationship that occurred in the city with this lab or what they may be trying to do in the future. And the city's going to do that work, I can assure you. That's what I really know. We're looking into that. And I've spoken to the city manager. I know they're all looking into that. All levels. No, I don't know. But you figure the county public health department is involved. They're responsible for the oversight there. That's why they're elected to be there. So they had to know at some point, clearly, I suspect they knew before July 25th when everyone else found out in the No, so that's what I'm saying. The public has a right to know, was this company sponsored by the Chinese government? Who are these people? What is their role in this lab? What was the role of the experimentation with COVID-19 with mice, genetically engineering them to carry the virus? Why is that going on? Why is it going on here? What's the purpose of that? The public has a right to know all of them. Now, this is not about Chinese people. This is about a lab where people are using COVID-19 and infectious agents on mice illegally, dumping it illegally, and apparently they happen to be Chinese nationals. We'll find out whether that's the case or not. But I know you want to inject race into it, that has nothing to do with this. There is no excuse as far as I'm concerned for not notifying the public of this. I hold the board of supervisors responsible and hold the Department of Public Health. It is the Department of Public Health. And Dr. Bora has no problem spending every week for the last 2 years during the pandemic spewing this information to the public, and yet he's incredibly silent now. So is the Department of Public Health. So is the Board of Supervisors, but they were silent during COVID the whole time. Well, the city of Reedley is the one that discovered it. Frankly, I want to give kudos to the Reedley Code Enforcement for finding it, for acknowledging it, for seeing it, for investigating it, and frankly, for all the agencies that are now investigating. That's exactly what needs to happen. I do not know anything yet. That's Reedley. Well, you have an illegal lab. You're genetically engineering COVID into mice, for what reason you don't know. You have a Department of Public Health that becomes aware of this very shortly. It's now been 5 months. The public is not informed of this except from a reporter who reported this to the local news outlet. That's unacceptable to me. It's unacceptable to people who are calling it. And it should be unacceptable to our constituents, which it is, when you have public officials who are supposed to be representing their interests, and they're not talking about this very dangerous behavior that's going on. If we can't understand that this is dangerous after going through COVID and millions of people dying, I don't know what it's going to take for elected officials to get off their asses and represent people. I'll leave that to the county. I think Dr. Moore should have lost his job long ago. I would have fired him long ago for all of the misinformation he was doing to the people in Fresno County. Listen, my position of who I am and what I do as a representative of the people is very clear. And my position and the way I conduct myself is very different from most politicians. I'm unafraid. I speak the truth. I don't back down from all of the attacks. and I'll be attacked here too, I'm sure. So they understand that, and that's a very different thing, whether it happens in a shall say. No. Well, I'm here today, speaking out as far as, so I Yep. I'm taking questions from public, like I'm asking right now. These questions, if my officials involved in this incident, doing that right there.
Ow.
Yes, sir. What you have to verify the concern is a verified concern. Well, if you understand COVID and
Fuck. Why? Peace. What? Fucking for real? Oh. Oh, fuck. Oh. What? Oh. What? I'm serious.
May I? As I thought, there's no battery in here. You remove the battery. That's a sorry little trick, isn't it? Yeah, you got me, Chuck. Dendrites. Remove the battery. God, Jimmy. Don't you know I know this is
The
real?
IRS made a giant reversal to one of their decades-long policies. Specifically,
They don't know.
2 days ago, the IRS made a giant reversal
to one of their decades-long policies. Specifically, they released a statement saying that IRS agents will no longer be going out to personally visit the homes of American taxpayers. Although at this point you might be saying, wait a minute, Roman, the IRS makes house calls? Well, they do. In fact, this practice has...
That's super annoying. Oh, for fuck's sake. Fuck. Something free. This is so fucking dumb. American country. Doing good. Yes. Oh shit. That is disgusting.
On this Sunday night, the consequences of the celebration turned sour. The fallout from the mayhem at Toronto's festival Eritrea. With police now under scrutiny. More bridges in Crimea bombed. Ukraine's new attacks and the latest war crime Russia is accused of. The fight for the right to choose in Texas.
The state doesn't care about the lives of their constituents.
The battle between judges and the potential punishments for doctors who perform abortions. And a milestone with fond military memories.
Because we wanted to see the world.
A Second World War veteran's flight path with the Royal Canadian Air Force.
Global National with Foreign Asset. Reporting tonight, Colleen Christie.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Outrage is mounting in Canada's largest city in the wake of a community celebration that turned violent. Chaos erupted yesterday when protesters stormed the Eritrean Festival in Toronto. It's intended to be a cultural celebration of the African nation, but experts say the protesters, Eritreans themselves, came out to demonstrate against the current government.
Oh, yeah.
As Amar Khan explains, the city has now cut the festival short.
chaos ensuing as protesters tear down fences and tents at Festival Eritrea in Toronto. On Saturday morning, violence breaking out, sending 9 people to the hospital, including one who was stabbed and critically injured.
The attack was totally unprecedented and improvised.
Members of Toronto's Eritrean community left stunned and shocked.
It's a kind of vandalism. This is what they did, is a vandalism. It's a senseless, I put it, it's a senseless disturbance.
Located in Northeast Africa and once part of Ethiopia, in 1993, Eritrea became its own country, now home to more than 3.5 million people. The festival has taken place in Toronto for 25 years, many of those at Earl's Court Park. An expert on African history says those who frequent the festival are supporters of the government and protesters against.
This is not the first time that there has been support or opposition to it around the world. Those opposing it are Eritreans who fled the unbridled tyranny in the country.
The violence led the city of Toronto to revoke the festival's license, essentially canceling it. On Sunday, a heavy police presence and City of Toronto security as the tents came down, many frustrated at the city's decision.
The victim is being re-victimized by revoking the license.
Kyriakakos says the Eritrean communities met with Toronto police, calling for security for several weeks, including as late as this week.
What went wrong? It's still to be accounted.
Toronto police say they deployed officers throughout the event and sent in reinforcements once the violence broke out. They added they are continuing to investigate the incident. The Eritrean community is supposed to host a gala event tonight, where protesters say they will be present. Kyriakakos says the police and city need to do better.
The threat is unacceptable. The potential violence is unacceptable.
This year's festival, Eritrea, is over, ending on a dark note. And this community that's familiar with hardship will now have to wait another year to celebrate its culture together. Amar Khan,
we
Global
can have
News,
fireworks
Toronto.
today.
It has been an unprecedented summer for wildfires across Canada, especially in British Columbia. In the past 24 hours alone, more than 30 new fires have begun in the province. Firefighters are using every tool at their disposal, and this weekend that includes starting fires. Alyssa Carpenter explains.
We don't want to evacuate in case it gets close to town. We don't want to lose power.
For Jim Hildebrandt and his neighbors living in and around Sparwood, BC, fire has become a part of the summer season. The Ladner Creek fire has been burning for weeks while more than 125 firefighters work night and day to try and keep it at bay.
They're doing control burns to so they won't get the power line and then stop it from spreading in town. So at least we're not going to lose our power here, hopefully.
But it's tinder dry, and just as residents thought firefighters were getting the upper hand, another flare-up over the weekend.
We actually returned from vacation and had seen a spark up. We actually lived down close to where some of the fires were burning on White Birch near the rec center.
There's a lot of dead stuff on the mountainside, and they gotta have to get rid of it somehow. It's Mother Nature doing its job.
The fire situation in this small BC community playing out right across British Columbia. Right now, there are more than 360 wildfires burning in the province. That includes 32 new fires in the past 24 hours. For Wildfire BC, it's a fine balancing act, juggling the resources needed to fight active fires, bringing in resources from other parts of Canada, while also employing prevention and suppression techniques. The BC Wildfire Service posting videos to its YouTube channel this weekend showing firefighters conducting several planned ignitions in various parts of the province. The goal is to get rid of what fuels the fire, that dry vegetation, by burning it away in a planned and controlled fashion.
It can be counterintuitive for folks because you're introducing fire to fire.
It says several successful planned ignitions have taken place, with more to come this week. While they are one effective tool, there are a number of other factors, including the forecast, that go into deciding whether that's the best way to fight an active fire. As for this fire near Sparwood, the mayor is betting on Mother Nature.
The only thing that's really going to put it out is snow. So we'll start seeing snow here in the next, up top, potentially in the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Alyssa Carpenter, Global News.
A major fire has erupted at a commercial lumber yard in Winnipeg. Firefighters first responded overnight, calling for more help as the flames grew. Several homes in the area were evacuated as precaution. People are now back home, but they're being told to keep their doors and windows closed due to air quality concerns. One firefighter suffered minor injuries and was treated at the scene. There are no reports of any other injury. From fire to water, at least 3 people have been killed in Slovenia as the country works to recover from devastating floods. A month's worth of rain hammered 2/3 of the country on Friday. The mayor of this northern settlement, nearly wiped out by the floods, says it's an enormous loss that has ruined us. While the cleanup is underway, roads have been washed out, buildings swamped, and bridges broken throughout the country. Slovenia's prime minister says this is the country's worst natural disaster. The government has earmarked 10 million euros for humanitarian aid. A passenger train has derailed in southern Pakistan, killing at least 30 people and injuring at least 100 others. The train was on a cross-country trip carrying about 1,000 people when several cars came off the tracks. Emergency crews are working to free survivors from the wreckage. Investigators are still trying to figure out what caused the derailment, but say the train was traveling at a normal speed. Accidents are common on Pakistan's decaying and outdated rail system. It's deadline day in Niger. West African neighbors are giving that military junta until today to reinstate democratically elected President Mohamed Bazoum. If it doesn't, it could face a military intervention. As of now, coup leaders haven't budged. Some people took to the streets of the country's capital today to voice their support for the coup. Ottawa is condemning it and has now suspended direct financial aid to Niger's government. Between 2021 and 2022, Canada provided more than $2.7 million to the country. Retaliatory attacks against Russian aggression appear to be ramping up. 2 bridges connecting Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine with Crimea have been damaged after an apparent missile attack. It marks Ukraine's latest attempt to disrupt Russian supply lines and military operations in Crimea and the Black Sea. And as Redmond Shannon reports, Kyiv is trying to shore up more international support against Russia's full-scale invasion.
Explosions at 2 of the bridges connecting Russian-annexed Crimea with the other Russian-held parts of Ukraine. The second attack on one of the bridges in 6 weeks. The local Russian-backed governor says damage to the important supply lines were caused by Ukraine's NATO-supplied Storm Shadow missiles. Like this one, President Volodymyr Zelensky signing one of the Storm Shadows provided by France. Note the Eiffel Tower on top of Ukraine's trident symbol. Zelensky posthumously honoring an Air Force member on the country's Air Force Day, praising service members for their efforts. Earlier this week, he said training on Western-supplied F-16 fighter jets will start this month. Zelensky said this overnight airstrike on a blood transfusion center is a war crime. It killed 2 people on a night when Ukraine says it shot down 57 of Russia's 70 missile and drone attacks. The volley, an apparent retaliation for Ukraine striking against a Russian Navy ship and a tanker in the Black Sea in recent days. Russia says it also intercepted another drone aimed at Moscow Sunday. And it accuses Ukraine of hitting a university in Russian-occupied Donetsk with cluster bombs. Global News cannot verify those claims. In Saudi Arabia on the weekend, the Ukraine Peace Conference gathered 40 nations together, excluding Russia, but including the Kremlin's hugely influential ally, China.
So what they're doing is they are trying to flip more neutral countries, and we saw China participate, which is a big deal.
The Jeddah meeting ended with participants agreeing on more talks. Zelensky hopes for a formal summit later in the year.
But it's going to take a lot of time, and I think the Ukrainian government is doing, hard diplomatic work and bringing people together who don't agree.
The territorial integrity of Ukraine is key to any peace plan. And on that, the 2 sides remain as far apart as ever. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
making a rare exception. Coming up, why a new ruling on the strict abortion ban in Texas likely won't hold. And how the next provincial election in this country could reverse the blue Tory wave. A painful back and forth battle is underway over abortion rights in Texas. A judge has ruled the state's abortion ban is too restrictive for women with serious pregnancy complications. But just as the temporary injunction was put in place, it was blocked by an appeal.
The state doesn't care about the lives of their constituents.
Less than 3 weeks after Amanda Zerowowski uttered those words, Judge Jessica Magrum agreed there needs to be an exception to the abortion laws in Texas. In her ruling, Magrum said, the court finds that there is uncertainty regarding whether the medical exception to Texas's abortion ban permits a physician to provide abortion care where in the physician's good faith judgment and in consultation with the pregnant person, a pregnant person has a physical emergent medical condition. But just as quickly as the injunction went into place, it was blocked by an appeal to the Texas Supreme Court. In a statement, the Attorney General's office called it ineffective, adding, the status quo remains in effect.
Millions of children were losing their lives every year in Texas before they were even born. But not any more in Texas.
Just
When a
over
man
year
has a
ago,
fucking
abortion
baby,
was banned in
I'll start
Texas
taking his
with
fucking
very
opinion on
few
it.
exceptions. It's one of 15 states that do not allow the procedure for fetal anomalies. Doctors who perform abortions risk life in prison, fines of up to $100,000. The challenge filed in March aimed to force clarity on exemptions under the strictest law in the U.S.
Awful.
Samantha Cassiano, one of 13 women who sued the state, became visibly distressed as she testified she'd had to carry her child Halo until she went into labor despite the baby's fatal condition.
I had to watch my baby.
Zerowowski says reliving her
Oh.
pain publicly was worth the outcome, but it's an outcome that may not stick
Oh,
in a state where
Jesus.
most abortion providers have already closed their doors. Ahead, expect plenty of mudslinging as Manitoba Conservatives fight to hang on in a fall election.
Fucked up, dude.
It's the middle of summer, but political pundits are already looking ahead to the fall when Canada's next provincial election is set to happen. Manitobans head to the polls October
miscarried
3rd.
at 5
Premier Heather
months.
Stephenson is looking to keep her Conservatives in power for a third term.
Yeah.
And despite a long
Give
Tory
very
winning
much.
streak, as Eric Sorensen
transparent.
explains, Stephenson is facing a tough fight.
Fucking
Since
lived like
taking over
3
as
days.
Manitoba's
Fucking
Conservative Premier, it's been a bumpy ride for Heather Stephenson. Polls showed Manitobans disapproved of her handling of the pandemic. More recently, she's been under fire from protesters and others for the province's decision not to fund the search of a landfill for missing persons.
I have to protect all Manitobans throughout this, including those that would be asked to go into those landfills.
That and issues such as health care have put Stephenson on the defensive against her main challenger, the NDP's Rob Canoe, with the next election just 8 weeks away.
I think it's time that you have a provincial government you can be proud of again.
Polls show the two parties are close, but the Conservatives trail in Winnipeg, where most battleground seats are fought.
They really have to work harder on getting Winnipeg voters on their side if they want to save power in the legislature.
Conservative parties have done well in provinces across the country ever since Justin Trudeau's federal Liberals were elected. Since 2015, voters in 7 provinces have changed from left of center to conservative-leaning governments: Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and the 3 maritime provinces. In all, 13 elections, including 6 conservative governments re-elected and no
Basically
defeats.
everybody?
Among provincial premiers, Saskatchewan's Scott Moe and Nova Scotia's Tim Houston have the highest approval rating in the most recent Angus Reid survey. But trailing the pack is Heather Stephenson of Manitoba, an approval of just 25%.
Sometimes you're going to have a situation where an electorate wants to zig a certain way federally and zag a certain way provincially, but also you can have an electorate that's simply tired of the government of the day.
Stephenson can expect to be in the crosshairs of both the Liberals, led by Dougal Lamont, and Canoe's NDP.
Heather Stephenson can run on the disaster of healthcare.
Stephenson told Global's Clay Young she's ready for what's coming.
I think we need to have thick skin in politics, and it's certainly not going to change anything that we're going to do to get out there and fight hard for Manitobans.
Christopher Adams expects a much
It will be a tough campaign. I think similar to what we saw in Alberta, I think we'll see some pretty heavy messaging coming up here in Manitoba.
No conservative provincial government in the country has lost in the last 8 years. Heather Stephenson's Manitoba PCs will have a fight on their hands, not to become the first. Eric Sorensen, Global News.
Next, the Second World War vet expected for her work and a milestone birthday. Heartbreak for Team USA at the Women's World Cup. It lost to Sweden in the round of 16 teams. The Americans had dominated every stat except the score, needing penalty kicks after a 0-0 draw. The game ended dramatically when the Swedes' game-winning shot was saved before video review showed the ball crossed the line by just millimeters. This is the earliest the U.S. women's national team has ever been eliminated from the World Cup. Most of us experienced the Second World War through photographs. That's also the case for Yvonne Wildman. The difference is she was actually there taking photographs as part of her job serving her country. One of many women working for the Royal Canadian Air Force. As Brody Radcliffe reports, she's celebrating a very special milestone with a lot of memories.
So you can become what you want to if you really push it.
It was an important week for Yvonne Wildman, celebrating her 100th birthday. Happy birthday! Yvonne grew up with 7 siblings, all of whom were boys. By the time she was 19, she joined the Royal Canadian Air Force.
My girlfriend and I decided to do because we wanted to see the world.
Like her dad, she was interested in engines, but her dream of working on motors was stalled. Mechanics required a grade 10 certificate. Yvonne only finished grade 8.
I went and get the dog. Not because I wanted to, because they wouldn't let me go into what I wanted to.
After 6 months of basic training, she was sent to Vulcan, Alberta, where she helped the bomber pilots train. Although she admits the first flight she was on made her queasy.
I couldn't have cared if that plane crashed.
When the war was over, Yvonne and the rest of the RCAF Women's Division were let go. She returned home, got married, and had 7 children.
Ew.
Not just telling her family about her experiences during the war, but showing them.
A part of my life I do again.
As for her secret to a long life, her lips are sealed. Do you have any secrets?
No.
No secrets at all, didn't.
Well, if I did, I wouldn't tell you.
Brody Radcliffe, Global News, Saskatoon.
And that is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Colleen Christie. Tonight's Your Canada is Vancouver's 45th annual Pride Parade. The theme for this year's festival is Reconnect, focusing on the Vancouver Pride Society's commitment to amplify marginalized community voices. The parade is also on a new expanded route for greater accessibility, allowing thousands to get together to have fun during BC's long weekend. Thanks for watching. Farm Master will be at the anchor desk tomorrow. Have a great night.
Republican Racket released a bombshell report last week that top scientists allegedly misled Congress about COVID origins. According to newly released emails and messages, the messages between Christian Anderson and his colleagues reportedly spanned the period during which they collaborated in writing proximal origin. According to the public, The messages show that Anderson and his colleagues thought it was possible, quote, not only that the virus that causes COVID-19 had leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but specifically that it had been cultured in a laboratory. This view is different than what Anderson and Dr. Robert Gary, two advisors to Dr. Anthony Fauci, said in their testimony to the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic last week.
Now evidence suggests that Fauci himself was behind COVID origins disinformation. According to Public, reports that in 2020, Fauci upheld the proximal origin paper as, quote, definitive scientific research. Joining us now to weigh in on all of this and how the investigation into COVID-19's origins might be impacting the public's trust in science is journalist Matt Taibbi. Matt, we are thrilled to have you back. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Robbie.
And we were just talking about this New York Times piece, which came out earlier today, this very, very, very long, neutral on its face, sort of seeming evaluation of the different possibilities, lab leak, lab leak delivered by a weapon, and natural spillover, where it's a very long article, and then at the end, the author kind of reveals their biases and starts to dig into, continue to push the animal spillover theory. The raccoon dogs, who I thought had been acquitted by now, come in for, to be additionally suspected again. What do you make of how this dialogue continues to unfold with so many interested parties still seeming to go, but animal spillover?
Yeah, it's really kind of an amazing article, isn't it, Rick? It's at the end, they dig into Frankenstein and tests of the D'Urbervilles and the JFK assassination. Basically, they're implying that all the reporting that we put out last week was speculative conspiracy theory, when actually all we were doing was just revealing that what the scientists at the time actually thought, which was that it was not only possible, but, quote, so friggin' likely, according to Anderson. And that's not conspiracy theory. That's not something that's picked out of the air. That's concretely what they were thinking at the time. And moreover, the Times actually kind of debunked a lot of the points that they went over in their own article with prior reporting earlier this year, especially at the end of April. So it's a very strange thing. It's like a lot of media stories. They just keep digging.
Absolutely. And I think what was so helpful in your disclosures and Michael Schellenberger's work on proximal origins is not only that they were very concerned it could have been a lab leak, and then we're looking, well, what changes their mind? But it also in there, it's clear that they think the truth will not actually come out, and that it would be better for scientists, for scientific advisors, for research funding, if it was not a lab leak. And those two things are very evident in the messages that you have helped discover. And I think thus, it gives an answer to the question, well, what causes them then to weigh so heavily on animal spillover? Well, it's because they thought they would get away with that explanation and it would be much better for them.
Well, that's what's so interesting about these communications. And you're right, they explicitly say, there's one line in there where one of the scientists, I'm forgetting whether it's Rambo or Gary, or actually it might have been Holmes, who said the truth will never come out if lab origin, or if lab escape is the truth. You couldn't put it more directly than that. But then there's this constellation of emails and communications between Nature magazine and the health officials, so one of the largest funders, Jeremy Farrar from Wellcome Trust, and Fauci and Francis Collins, and it's abundantly clear that they want the paper to say basically that there's no possibility of lab origin, and the scientists, you can see them over time moving towards accepting that position. They were rejected initially when they by Nature because the paper was not enough in that direction, and they eventually made that change. That's what's so interesting about these documents, and it shows how strongly they felt they couldn't exclude this possibility.
This document, or rather documents, you say, if you read them like a novel from what's been released by the public, you have these exchanges between the four scientists. And you also say in your piece in news that they might not necessarily be evil. How do we move forward from this, understanding that from the research perspective, they might not want people to know that this was a lab leak because that might mean less funding for research. They find their research very important. Of course, it's kind of a disgustingly paternalistic approach to assume the public can't handle the idea that it was a lab leak. But how do we move forward from this and have some kind of, laws passed for better research protocols when it comes to matters of public health? Can we? Because you say also in your piece that it's kind of like walking in on a spouse cheating. Now that people know how this research was released, it's hard to go back from that. And it's kind of destroyed institutional trust. How do you see we move forward productively?
Yeah, and this is a point that Dr. Jay Bhattacharya made when I talked to him. How does science recover from this? How do you regain trust? And it's similar to what happens in journalism. After an episode like, for instance, the WMD affair or even Russiagate, I would argue, once the public is betrayed and they see that they've been betrayed, it's very hard to win that trust back. And in science, it's the same thing. You affirmatively have a mission to ignore things like political considerations in science. You have to just follow what the science says. And what you see in these communications is that they not only did that, but they did it consciously, and they talk about doing it. They say things like, I hate it when political considerations enter science, but in this case, it's unavoidable. The public is going to see that, and they're now going to think every time there's some quote-unquote consensus among scientists that perhaps the conclusion has been politicized, and there's no way to regain that trust. I think you both agree. It's just like journalism. It's organic. You can only do it over a period of time when you prove to be trustworthy again and again and again. And they've really undermined quite a lot, I think, in this episode.
Yeah, in this long New York Times piece, they note that if you poll people on what they think is the more likely way that COVID came to be, that it's not even close. Most people, Republicans, Democrats, ordinary people are inclined toward the lab leak theory at this point decisively. We know that the scientists who looked at this initially, privately, were pretty mixed and pretty fearful of the lab leak scenario. We know that the FBI and the Energy Department have concluded the lab leak is more likely. There's all these people who think lab leak is just as plausible, if not more likely. Like the last category of people to come around this way of thinking is, in fact, the mainstream media that so confidently asserted not just that the lab leak was wrong, but that it was racist and conspiratorial to think that. On the basis of listening to scientists, we now have so many examples. The Hunter Biden laptop story being another one of the experts saying injecting into the atmosphere a conclusion that I think is too strong, and then the media taking that and making an even stronger claim than the one the experts made, and then doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on that because why do they do that? Because they would look foolish if they had to admit that they did their own misinformation, even from the perspective of the experts they were relying on.
I don't understand why they do that, but you're absolutely right, Robbie. That's like a new phenomenon in media where somebody will put out a story that says X, and on the very day of that story, you immediately get all these headlines that are X plus 1, X plus 2, X plus 3, right? So, for instance, you talk about the Hunter Biden story. When the 50 intelligence officers put out that letter, what they said was, this has all the earmarks of a classic Russian information operation. And right away, Politico has a headline that says, intelligence officers say, laptop story is Russian disinfo, right? So they go from information to disinformation in the headline. And that happened in this case too. The proximal origin paper really only said that we think laboratory origin is improbable, but right away you had headlines saying this was natural origin and lab leak was excluded, basically using this as the source. And this became basically an article of faith among both politicians and members of the media. And it's this kind of thing that it's a snowballing phenomenon that we see over and over again in the press. And I'd be curious to hear what you think. I think it's a new thing in the media, isn't it?
It is a new thing. I mean, my theory is that the expert class, scientists, intelligence officers, even like federal law enforcement, are now just kind of part of the same team as the mainstream media. These are the experts that are relied upon. If you watch CNN and MSNBC, it's all prosecutors, it's all former State Department officials, it's all Sanjay Gupta type people who are part of the expert class. So there's a lot more skepticism on there's just like wild skepticism on everything on like the Republican side. Even skepticism that goes like beyond the natural skepticism I even have. But on the Democratic and mainstream establishment side, it's just trust. It's trust in what the experts say and some kind of which is intention. Yeah. So I turn this back to you. Someone who has been in the media for a long time and doing great reporting and debunking things that were believed to be true by experts in media, etc. There's more belief and there's more like, well, if you're going to question things, you should like be a Republican or something.
It's very strange because I always thought one of the cool things about being a reporter was that you didn't have to come to a conclusion. You put out the stuff that you have. If you only have a certain amount of information, if it only gets you so far, but not all the way to an absolute conclusion, whatever, you're doing your job honestly, you put it out there, you go to sleep, you wake up the next morning, and maybe you find something different the next day. I think a lot of people in the profession now feel pressure immediately to come to a conclusion that satisfies one or the other political directions of the moment. And so they feel an obligation to get 100% to the end of a question when they do every story. But that's not the way journalism works. Not even in this story that we did. I mean, we're not proving that it came out of a lab. All these documents show is that there was significant apprehension at the very beginning of the story, which I think is very interesting. It's not conclusive, but that's sort of how journalism works. And it's also, by the way, how science is supposed to work. And this pressure that we're seeing to come to absolute whole conclusions, I think is very dangerous and also makes the job very unpleasant on top of everything else.
Yeah, I'm curious what you make, just really quick, last question, of the timing of the changing narrative where for so long it was, most likely from animal origins, and then it was in the same, I think, span of a week that we were discussing the banning of TikTok and the Chinese spy balloon, and then also, hey, guess what? Maybe it was a lab leak. To me, that sounds like this kind of manufacturing consent. Let's be mad at China this week so we can get this substantive piece of legislation passed that would give Congress a lot of control around freedom on the internet. What do you make of that larger picture and that narrative?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I have thought about the fact that I don't think a lot of these stories would have come out had there not been some consensus in some parts of the intelligence community that we want this stuff to come out. Some of the stories that we did at Public and Racket involving, for instance, the names of the people who were reported to have been sick at the Wuhan lab in November of 2019. And also the fact that the Department of Energy and the FBI came around to a conclusion that lab leak was probable or likely. This story probably doesn't happen if there was not that conclusion internally and there was not some internal institutional momentum towards putting this out there. Why is that? Why do they want to do that now? I don't know. That's a good question. I think it needs to be answered, though.
And just real quickly before we let you go, I have to ask this because, you were grilled in front of Congress by, Democratic members when you testified on the Twitter files, and Delegate Stacey Plaskett was, particularly strident with you. I think she threatened to put you in jail for perjury. She was equally strident with RFK Jr. when he testified on kind of some similar issues, how the federal government might have pushed social media companies to censor, and they tried to prevent the entire hearing from taking place. And they said Stacey Plaskett came as close as you possibly can. I read our comments very closely to explicitly saying that misinformation should not be protected by the First Amendment. Can you comment on our Democratic representatives' transformation on this free speech subject with respect to you and RFK Jr. and others who are talking about these issues?
Sure. First of all, I thought the optics of that hearing were unbelievable. I was expecting something weird. Obviously, I had been in front of that same committee, and even in the middle of it, I was sort of amazed at how crazy it got. But the decision by the Democrats to try to move the entire hearing into executive session, when the hearing was about censorship, a comedy writer couldn't script that. That would be a difficult thing to come up with, I think, without a little bit of inspiration. And I don't think they see the optics of that. I think they think that this looks good on video, whereas in fact I think it looks crazy, and it makes RFK look like the calm, normal person that you would that can relate to ordinary people. But what you mentioned with Representative Plaskett, she said essentially that this is not the kind of the protected speech that I know. I forget the exact phrasing of her quote, but it read like, I don't think she really knows what the First Amendment is and why it exists and why we protect speech that we don't find, that we ourselves don't agree with or find offensive. This is a core part of the American tradition, and it seems alien to this new cast of Democrats, and I don't really understand it because there was always that person in the Democratic caucus who was a real believer in these issues, and it's strange to see it just disappear that way.
Strange and sad. Matt Taibbi, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me on.
I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I'm running for President of the United States. This campaign is about protecting our environment. I've been fighting corporate corruption my entire life, and about safeguarding our children from toxic chemicals and drugs, about healing the divide. I'm running to bring our country together.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., can he capture the magic of Camelot?
My father and my uncle had a vision for America.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
A vision of racial harmony, peace in the world, and honest government.
Or will his own controversial positions stop him?
I'm accused of passing misinformation on the side that shows that autism is caused by vaccines. There's over 100 studies. Wi-Fi radiation does all kinds of bad things, including causing cancer. There seems to be an almost frantic need to discredit me. I would urge people to listen to my own words.
Tonight, live across America, we welcome you to the RFK Jr. Town Hall.
Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Elizabeth Vargas. Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has his sights set on something that hasn't been done in modern U.S. history, beating the sitting president for his party's nomination for the White House. And so far, he's off to a solid start, polling at 15% against Joe Biden in a recent Emerson College poll. His connection to what is akin to American political royalty is right there in the name. RFK Jr.'s statements, however, on issues like vaccines and public health have critics calling him a conspiracy theorist, and others asking if he is the right person for the most important job in our nation, possibly the world. Still, Kennedy believes it's his ability to take on that established power that American voters want. And that's why tonight is about you, the audience. It is your chance to ask questions and hear directly from Kennedy about the issues that matter most to you, live and unedited. And no topic is off limits. We've brought together Democratic and independent voters right here in Chicago, as well as in New Hampshire and South Carolina, the first states to cast their primary ballots in 2024. But first, everyone, please welcome me in joining Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to the stage. Let's get the part out of the way. Your voice is raspy. Why don't you explain to our audience why?
I had a very, very strong voice till I was 46 years old. It was unusually strong, and I was even at that time, I was making a lot of my income doing public speaking, and I could speak to large halls without any amplification. And then in 1996, when I was 42 years old, I got struck with a disease, a neurological disease, an injury called spasmodic dystonia, and it makes my voice tremble. And I actually, at the time, I didn't know what was wrong with it, but when I would go on TV, people would write me letters and say, "You have spasmodic dystonia, and you should see Dr. Blitzer, who was the physician who was most famous for treating it." And I ultimately went to see him, and he confirmed that I had the diagnosis. So it makes it. I think it makes it problematical for people to listen to me. I cannot listen to myself on TV. I will never listen to this broadcast, and I won't listen to any. So I feel sorry for you guys having to listen to me.
All right.
But I'll say one other thing. My throat was much worse, and I went to Japan with Cheryl about 6 months ago and had a novel surgery that they only do in Kyoto. And it made my voice much better, which you probably won't believe, but it was much worse than this before. So.
Okay. Well, we have a lot of questions tonight for you from our audience. Let's get started. Before that, though, I want to say you are asking Democratic voters in this room and across the country to do something that hasn't been done in 167 years in this country, to vote out a president of their own party. Not to mention, replace him with somebody who hasn't even held elective office. Why should they take that chance?
Well, I'm running because I feel like my party has lost its way. That the values that my uncle represented, my father represented when they were Democrats, have been neglected, let's say. And I want to try to bring the Democratic Party back to those values that were, in favor of focus on the middle class in this country, focused on labor, on racial, on the well-being of minorities in this country, focused on the environment, particularly on civil liberties and freedom of speech, which the party has seems to have forgotten about. And the party traditionally was anti-war as well. My uncle, President Kennedy, was asked by his friend what he wanted on his epitaph, on his gravestone, and he said he kept the peace. He said the principal job of an American president is to keep the country out of war, and the Democratic Party has represented those views since the inception. And I think, particularly what we're doing now in Ukraine is a departure from that, and I don't mean that. I'm very, very sympathetic to the Ukrainian people, and I am not sympathetic to Putin, who invaded Ukraine brutally and illegally and unnecessarily. But we have neglected many, many opportunities to settle this war peacefully. And by the way, my son, Connor, went over to the Ukraine and fought for a special forces unit. He was a machine gunner. And he fought in the Kharkiv offensive. And so I, myself and my family, are very, very sympathetic to the Ukrainian people. I think the way that we have conducted the war is bad for the Ukrainian people, is terrible for the Ukrainian people.
This is a story that's been very much in the headlines this week with the failed rebellion in Russia by Putin's own mercenary henchman, Yevgeny Prigozhin. The world held its breath because Russia has more nuclear weapons than any country on the planet. And I want to take us to our first question from Tiani in Manchester, which is about Russia. Tiani?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. I have heard and read that you believe that Russia has acted in good faith towards trying to resolve the war in Ukraine. And I'm wondering if that is actually your position, and how would you bring peace to the region without emboldening Putin and threatening democratic self-government around the world?
Well, that is a bit of a misstatement in what I said. What I said was that in April of 2022, the war began on February 24th, 2022. In April, there was a peace outreach by Putin and Zelensky. And they actually signed a peace agreement. And at that time, and and Boris Johnson was dispatched by the White House to sabotage that agreement. The Russians were acting in good faith. After signing that agreement, they were actually withdrawing troops from the area around Kiev. So it was clear that they were operating in good faith at that point, and we were not operating in good faith. We should be trying to settle this war through diplomacy. Since then, there have been 350,000 Ukrainian kids that have been killed, and we've turned that nation into a proxy war between Russia and the United States. And by the way, we were told this was a humanitarian exercise. If it was humanitarian, it means reducing bloodshed and shortening the conflict. But when President Biden was asked, why are we over there? He said, for regime change of Vladimir Putin. In April of 2021 or 2022, his defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, said that the reason for America's presence in the Ukraine is to degrade the Russian military and exhaust its capacity to operate anywhere in the world. That is the opposite of a humanitarian mission. That is a mission about a war of attrition in which the people who are dying are Ukrainians. And that's...
You would negotiate a solution that what does that look like? Do you award President Putin of Russia part of Ukraine?
We know what the solution would look like because the Russians have agreed to the solution twice. Once they agreed to the Minsk Accords, and the Minsk Accords, which were agreed to by Germany, by France, and by Russia, said maintain Donbass as part of the Ukraine. By the way, the Donbass voted to leave the Ukraine 90-10, about 90% together.
Was the election last year?
No, the early elections, and Putin refused to take them. So Putin did not. But let me finish this. The Donbass or the Minsk Accords, which all those countries agreed on, and then in 2019, Zelensky ran for president for the first time. He's a comedian and actor with no political experience. He won on a peace platform with 70% of the vote. His campaign was, I will sign and ratify the Minsk Accords if I'm elected. And as soon as he got elected, he pivoted. Why? Because of U.S. pressure from the neocons from Victoria Nuland and the neocons in the White House. They did not want peace. And because of pressure from ultra-nationalists within the Ukraine who said they were going to kill him if he signed the accord.
But if you negotiate with Putin right now and get him to stop his invasion, I know you said you're not defending Putin, but he's an accused war criminal. He poisons his enemies and imprisons his enemies. He's an autocrat. So if you award him part of Ukraine, what message are you sending to dictators and autocrats around the world who are looking to neighboring countries thinking, hey, I want some of that?
When my uncle was president and his military apparatus wanted him to go to war with Vietnam, with Laos, with Cuba, with the Soviet Union during the Berlin crisis in 1982, he said, you have to put yourself into the shoes of your adversary. If we're going to have peace, you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the adversary and see the world from their perspective and recognize their legitimate security concerns. Now, we have, with a series of provocations, including unilaterally walking away from the two medium-range nuclear missile treaties with Russia, which we all signed, and President Trump and President Obama walked away from those. We promised in 1992 that we would, after the Russians made a huge concession of leaving 400,000
Can't believe this one on me, 'cause I'm not really a huge fan of your Gatorade.
East and West Germany under NATO control, which was adversary armies to them. And they said, the one thing we want from you is that you will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. And Secretary of State Baker said at that time, famously, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Since then, we have moved it 1,000 miles to the east and 14 countries, and we put Aegis missile systems in Romania and Poland right near Russia's border. When Russia with nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is farther away than we now have, to Moscow. We would have invaded if they hadn't withdrawn them. My uncle was president then. We would have gone in. And my uncle knew why the Russians had done that. He did it because they did it. Khrushchev did it because we had put nuclear missile systems, Jupiter systems, in Italy and in Turkey. And my uncle, my father, met with Ambassador Dobrynin secretly and made a secret deal. If you remove your missiles now, we will take ours out of Turkey. So, the Russians have been invaded 3 times of the Ukraine. The last time they were invaded, the Germans killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. They destroyed all of them, 1/3 of Russia to rubble. They burned the fields. Wow. It's as if my uncle said this in his 1963 speech at American University. He said they destroyed the equivalent of destroying the entire part of the United States from the East Coast to Chicago. Imagine if all the wheat fields, all the forests were burned, all the cities reduced to rubble. That's what was done. They have a legitimate concern about us moving NATO into the Ukraine. We would never let them put missile systems in Canada or Mexico. We would invade if they did that, and we have to be able to put ourselves in their positions.
We have a lot of questions to get to, but you know that the vast majority of Democrats fully and consistently have supported President Biden on his support of Ukraine's war. You seem to be out of step with the voters majority that you're asking.
That doesn't make it right, Elizabeth. That does not make it right. We need to be a moral nation. We need to restore our moral authority around the world. If every Democrat is against me on that, I'm still going to say it. I'm going to tell people the truth and our leadership.
And you think giving part of Ukraine to Putin is restoring our moral
authority? I
authority?
didn't say giving part of Ukraine to Putin. Putin agreed originally to leave Ukraine alone if we signed the agreement. So, Putin was not demanding any part of Ukraine, even though the ethnic Russians voted 90 to 10 in the Donbass to join Russia. He said no. Oh, I don't know what the negotiation would look like exactly, but I know what they agreed to before, and it was a reasonable agreement. They just did not want NATO to go into Ukraine, and we said, we don't care. By the way, when we originally said that we were going to do this, George Kennan, who is the most important diplomat in American history, he was the architect of the containment policy after World War II. He is a deity in American statesmanship. He said, if you go into the Ukraine, you're going to force the Russians to have a violent response. William Perry, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, said, if you go into the Ukraine with NATO, I'm going to resign because you are forcing the Russians to retaliate violently. And William Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, was then the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, said the same thing. He said, you cannot move NATO into the Ukraine because it is going to force the Russians to retaliate violently. And he said, he called it a red line. He said, if you cross that red line, Russia is going to have to go into the Ukraine. So all of us knew that. All of our diplomats knew that. And the comic book depiction that the American people have been told by their leadership, I want to tell you something. The seats that you're sitting on today, you know who first had put those seats in here? The very seats you're sitting on. Donahue. Bill Donahue. Bill Donahue was the most important, the most popular daytime host. And you know what happened to him at the height of his popularity? He told the truth about the Iraq War. He said there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. 2 days later, he lost his job. And that's why those seats are empty.
Wow.
So we have to, and now we all know he was right. So what I'm saying today, I know 10 years from now, everybody's going to understand this is the truth. We have been lied to by our press, by our government, and we need to start hearing the truth, and we need to stop paying attention to these comic book depictions that say there's bad guys and good guys, and America's always the good guy, and we never make mistakes. We have to understand there's nuance, there's complexity in our relationships, and we need to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of our adversaries if we're going to have true peace in the world, which we all want.
All right, this takes us to a question from Sandy Muller, a stay-at-home mom in Chicago. Might be interesting given what you just said.
Your father and uncle were heroes in the Democratic Party. would they be considered Democrats today? And are you shocked by how you are being treated by the Democrats in the media?
I'm not happy about it. But I'm not shocked. I know. You know, people get subsumed in orthodoxy. I believe that the values that I am trying to promote are the exact values that my father and my uncle would have promoted. And I've written books about my family. I've studied them. I have, you know, the more that I've studied my family, the more I've written and researched on my uncle and my father, the more proud I am of them. And I have devoted my life to promoting the same kind of values that I think they promoted. And I'm trying to, one of my purposes in running is to remind the Democratic Party of, you know, what we are supposed to represent and what we've always represented. And, you know, people have said to me, why don't you run it as an independent? Why don't you? And I say, because I'm a Democrat. This is who I am. This is my identity, but I want my party back. I want my party to be the party that I grew up with, the party of John Kennedy, the party of Robert Kennedy, the party of FDR, and Harry Truman.
You say that you're a Democrat, but you're getting a lot of support from a lot of leading voices on the right, like Steve Bannon, Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones, former President Donald Trump. Many Democrats fear that you're a spoiler in the race, that you will damage President Biden in the primary and grease the skids for former President Trump to return to the Oval Office. This week, former President Trump said about you, Kennedy is smart and he's a common sense guy. What kind of man do you think Donald Trump is?
Who cares?
Well, you know, here's what I'm not going to do in this race. I'm not going to attack other people personally. I don't think it's good for our country. And I think, you know, what I'm trying to do in this race is bring people together, is to try to bridge the divide between Americans. And guess what? You know, when my dad died and we took this train ride from, you know, this 7.5-hour train ride that was supposed to be 2 hours, I was with him when he died in Los Angeles, and then we brought his body from New York, Penn Station, to Union Station, and Washington, D.C. And it was a 2.5-hour ride, but it took 7.5 hours because there were 2.5 million people on that train track. And it was a cross-section of America, all of the major urban stations in Trenton, Newark, Wilmington, and Baltimore. There were Black Americans seeing battle in the Republic. There were whites in the rural areas who were holding up signs, goodbye Bobby, pray for us Bobby, American flag, standing, saluting. 4 years later, and they had supported my father in the primaries in 1968. 4 years later, in 1972, they were not supporting my father, and they were not supporting George McGovern, who was aligned with my father on all these issues. Instead, the vast majority of them were supporting George Wallace. And, you know, my father was able to harness these populist energies. In the last day of his life, he won the most rural state in this country, South Dakota, and the most urban. He was able to bridge the divide among people who would otherwise be Republican, but wanted somebody who was common sense, who was able to appeal to their idealism, who was able to find the hero in each of them, who was able to get them to transcend narrow self-interest and see themselves as part of the community and part of this, you know, incredible American adventure in modeling self-governance for the rest of the world. And so I'm proud that President Trump likes me, even though I don't agree with him on most of his issues, because I don't want to alienate people. I want to bring people together. I'm proud that all these people like me and that I have independent supporters and Democratic supporters, and that I'm able to bring a lot of people up. You know, every Democrat says, I want to end the polarization. But how do you do that without talking to people who don't agree with you? How do you do that without appealing to people? My purpose is to find the issues, the values that we have in common, other than, you know, focus on the issues, the personalities that keep us all apart.
As a lifelong Democrat, as you just said very passionately, will you pledge to support whoever the Democratic nominee is? Whoever it is, whether it's you, whether it's President Biden?
It's a fucking competition.
I'm not going to do No, of course, I'm not.
If you don't get the nomination, you won't support President
I don't
Biden.
know what it'll do. Let's see let's see what happens in this campaign. Let's see, you know what, if
That's why
if people are
fucking
living
Bernie
up to
Sanders
democratic
lost.
values and having debates and having discussions and, you know, talking to each other, but I'm not
And
gonna
if you
buy
know
it.
that's not happening, would you then support a Republican or run as an independent?
You know what, my plan is to win this election, and I don't have a plan B.
Okay. We are in Chicago, which will be the host to the Democratic National Convention next summer. It is also where President Biden came today to unveil his economic blueprint. He's calling it Bidenomics. The economy is a huge issue with voters of all stripes across the country. That leads to our next question from George, a contractor in the Chicago area. Hi, George.
Everywhere I look, prices are sky high. From gasoline to groceries to building materials. Inflation and the uncertainty which it brings with it is damaging our economy. What is your plan to reduce inflation?
Thank you, George. I I have a long-term plan and a short-term plan, but you know, the current plan, which is to raise interest rates dramatically, and to
Stop printing money.
to end the quantitative easing, I think is really doing tremendous damage. I was in Cleveland yesterday meeting with African American business people in a community called the Lee Harvard community. And one after the other, they were getting up and telling me, one of them was a woman who had operated for 4 generations, 80 years, a sausage company that was very, very successful. She just had to, and it was bringing lots of prosperity to her community and lots of jobs. She just had to close it down because she couldn't get a bank loan. She couldn't get a bank loan because the interest rates are high, and the little banks, the ones that have loans to small businesses, their treasury bills have now been degraded in value, and they're scared about their targets for takeover. Their stocks have dropped to 80% because of the heightened interest rates, and they're not loaning money anymore. And there's no money available to people who need it. And so, you know, what we've done, we've sandbagged Americans. You're right. And why do we have inflation? We have inflation because of the continuous wars.
Wait, what specifically would you do to lower inflation?
Well, number one, I'm gonna wind down the American empire and start. We've spent $8 trillion on the Iraq War and the wars that followed, and we spent $16 trillion on the pandemic, on the lockdown. The lockdown cost us $16 trillion, and we got nothing for it. We got nothing for the Iraq War. We end up killing more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein.
Little skills I have. Where's they always know?
What are you going to do?
Little scales?
Yeah.
And the gasoline that they're paying for.
The little colors feel like backwoods.
The only way that we can do that is by reducing
In
inflation.
your room?
And inflation.
That's the
is not gonna be
TV?
reduced overnight. What we need to do
In
is
that
stop
brown
spending
cabinet.
money on things that we can't afford. We're borrowing now $1 billion a day from the Chinese and the Japanese in order to fund the debt. The debt this year
Am I right?
cost us $660 billion, more than $500 billion just to service on the debt. We're not going to end that problem overnight, but we got to recognize that we've got to stop. We've got to stop. We're sending
All right.
$113 billion to the Ukraine. The entire budget of CDC is $12 billion. The budget of EPA is $12 billion. Well, 57% of Americans could not put their hands on $1,000 if they have an emergency in their family. 25% of Americans are hungry. Oh, I have a friend who was on food stamps. He's a commercial fisherman. He's worked his entire life up to the work to the bone, created a business, gave it to his son-in-law. And he was injured. He's on permanent disability. He was getting food stamps, $283 a month. And those food stamps are now worth a lot less because the inflation paid for the wars caused 76% rise in dairy, milk, and eggs over the past 2 years. On March 1st, he got a robocall from the government saying that his food stamps are being cut by 90%. So he was getting 280 from
Okay, bro. Come on, mister. Fucking. Wow. Lord. Okay, Booby. Oof. Fuck. Alright. Booby. Uncle P. Oh. Hmm? Mm. 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 What? Mm. Break off. Mm. Why? Mm. Mm. Okay. Uncle P? Oh. Yeah, I know, mister. Oh, foot. No, put it up. Go feed the dog first. Oh, Jack. Hey.
me. You okay? You okay? Baby. You don't make any noises. You're doing so good for a few days. Right? You're doing really good for a few days. What happened? You're all easy again. Good. You're doing so good. What happened? Maybe we should throw it away. Mm-hmm. You in the kitchen? God damn.
If I pull a tick off my dog, does he need to be treated for Lyme disease? very much it. Balloon ticks. Oh, okay. What the fuck? Oh, fucking shit, fuck. Ugh. Ugh. Okay. Oh, we should shave you like right now. Fuck. Ça c'est pas bon, Jack. Okay. So I'm going to be grossed out right now. Can't fucking believe this.
We must fight the woke in our schools. We must fight the woke in our businesses. We must fight the woke in government agencies. We can never, ever surrender to woke ideology. And I'll tell you this, the state of Florida is where woke goes to die.
For over a year now, conservatives have been pushing a familiar narrative. random people who are part of or considered to be in proximity to the LGBTQ community, trans women especially, are being accused of recruiting children into being gay or trans and labeled as groomers.
For grooming.
Groomers.
We've seen this narrative played out many times throughout history. But before we go into how this rhetoric works, it's important to be clear about its consequences. Because recently, violence against the LGBT community and anyone seen to be supporting it has been rapidly escalating. 2022 was a horrible year for violence against the LGBTQ community. Groups like the Proud Boys and Patriot Front have been showing up armed outside of drag brunches more and more frequently. Many LGBT teachers and parents have been doxxed and harassed after videos of them were posted online to millions of angry conservatives on accounts like Libs of TikTok. And of course, November saw the horrific shooting at the gay bar Club Q in Colorado. Hundreds of events have had to be canceled because of threats, and anti-LGBT legislation, specifically targeting the trans community, has been on the rise. For the graph people out there, in 2022, the ACLED found that since 2020 and 2021, anti-LGBTQ political violence, demonstrations, and the involvement of far-right militias in anti-LGBT activities have all gone up, with over 200 incidents last year alone. For yet another consecutive year, hate crimes of this kind are going up, and the increase in anti-LGBTQ rhetoric has a lot to do with it. We know this because this is something that multiple studies have confirmed. When there is an increase in rhetoric targeting a specific, usually minority group, hate crimes against that group go up. But these are large trends, and in some cases, this link between rhetoric and increased violence is just obvious and undeniable.
This is a threat that came in via encrypted email.
For example, take what happened to the Boston Children's Hospital. Last August, the Twitter account Libs of TikTok started posting about the hospital and claiming, incorrectly, that minors were receiving hysterectomies there. To be completely clear, and I'm quoting the Boston Globe here, the types of gender-affirming care that Boston Children's Hospital offers ranges from simple interventions, such as allowing patients to use preferred names and pronouns in their medical records, to counseling, hormonal therapy to delay puberty, or transition to a different gender. For patients 15 and older, breast surgery is an option, as is genital surgery for those 18 and older. Nothing that is shocking or out of line with the recommendations of several credible medical associations. And these measures have been shown to decrease the risk of suicide for the recipients of gender-affirming care by as much as 73%. This care is literally life-saving, and only 3% of those who receive it detransition permanently, with less than half of 1% of trans patients reporting surgical regret. Just keep that in mind throughout the rest of the video. Anyway, Libs of TikTok, if you don't already know, is an account that regularly posts TikTok clips accusing LGBTQ teachers and parents of being groomers, which, for some reason, frequently gets it featured on Tucker Carlson's show.
Libs of TikTok. Honestly, well, it's a Twitter account, but it's become one of the most important sites of reporting in the new media.
Last August, the account started targeting the Boston Children's Hospital with these bogus hysterectomy claims. And right away, the hospital was on the receiving end of a wave of harassment, phone calls, emails, and death threats, eventually escalating into a bomb threat that shut down the hospital while the staff and the family of the patients had to wonder what would happen to everyone in the building. Just imagine for a second how disruptive a bomb threat can be in a hospital where you have risky medical procedures like surgery going on. This is a big deal. And despite this clear link between targeted rhetoric and harassment, accounts like Libs of TikTok haven't stopped. The Boston Children's Hospital has continued to receive bomb threats for months since that first incident. And Chaya Raichik, the person behind the Libs of TikTok account, has directed the attention of her followers, and therefore the same storm of death threats, towards at least one other hospital in Washington. Tucker Carlson, too, with his millions of viewers every weeknight, has done the same thing, running segments with the header, "Hospitals are mutilating children," and drumming up the same kind of anger and threats of violence to hospitals all around the country. There's an obvious link. Libs of TikTok and Carlson talk about a hospital, and it immediately suffers a wave of threats. We've seen this story multiple times at this point. The effect is predictable. There is no more denying the link, but that hasn't stopped Carlson and Raichik from encouraging this violence. But it's not always this direct. The current trend in violence against LGBTQ people has been happening through a much more generalized association between queer people, trans women especially, and pedophilia. Let me explain how this works. There are 3 steps to the process. First, you associate queer people with pedophilia over and over and over and over again. Second, you attach this topic to a larger culture war fixation, turning it into a moral panic threatening to undermine the very fabric of society. And third, you bring in the vigilantes and legitimize state violence. So first, it starts by associating LGBTQ people with grooming. For this, accounts like Libs of TikTok are an obvious starting point. Just scrolling through Rychik's feed, you'll see that just about every post on her page is attacking someone in the LGBTQ community, and every accusation of grooming is directed at a queer person. Same goes for Tucker Carlson segments.
California Teachers Association is one of the most powerful unions in the country, and it's purely an organ of the Democratic Party. Recently, the union held a conference to discuss how to indoctrinate school children without their parents' knowledge. One first grade teacher called Blair Wyatt explained that it's best to hold meetings for gender identity clubs during lunchtime so that parents never know.
And same goes for Laura Ingraham segments, who, in this next clip, implies that accepting trans youth would somehow lead to the lowering of the age of consent.
And if children can choose this, then the next thing is going to be choosing consent for sexual activity. If they can choose this, then why can't they make other choices? I mean, there's a lot to this story. Guys, thanks so much. Coming up.
In all these clips, in all the TikToks featured on Rychik's account, the same associations are constantly reinforced. Queer equals grooming. To try and preserve plausible deniability, these hosts will often say something quick like this: "It's not you gay people." But don't be fooled. A story on Fox only becomes a case of grooming when a queer person or a member of the LGBTQ community is involved. Remember, at Hooters, on Sundays, kids eat free. Okay, we're getting out here. I don't feel like getting shot talking about gender at Hooters. The idea behind this rhetoric isn't necessarily to claim that every single queer person is a groomer, but just that they're more likely to be. This, in turn, justifies increased suspicion of the LGBT community, increased policing, and therefore increased violence. And it all rests on the false idea that simply being queer constitutes a sexual act. Being straight or cisgender has nothing to do with sex. In the conservative imagination, it's just a neutral condition of being. But by contrast, being gay, trans, or queer in any fashion has an innate sexual character. And this is obviously wrong. Attraction and gender identity have little to do with sex, at least no more for a queer person than for a straight or cisgender person.
What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick. You see, Ralph was a homosexual.
But by appealing to this widespread assumption and years of association in media and politics between queerness and pedophilia in successive moral panics in the 50s, 70s, and 80s, conservatives can make it seem like being out in a space where kids might be constitutes child abuse. And if that seems a little far-fetched, they can fall back on the implication that child abuse is more likely to happen when queer people are around children. And therefore, they can justify to their audiences the criminalization and violence committed against those in the LGBT community who are out on the pretext of catching bad apples, forcing as many queer people as possible back into the closet while keeping a new generation in the closet indefinitely. And I hate that I feel the need to specify this, but queer people are of course not more likely to commit acts of child abuse. There is empirical evidence for this statement that should be immediately obvious to most people. But constantly trying to create a link between LGBT people and grooming is only step one. The next part of the process involves tying that narrative to something bigger. In other words, this problem is everywhere.
Once again, this is everywhere.
For a media narrative to become a moral panic, it has to become universalizing and apocalyptic. And to do that, moral panics tend to rely on a few tropes. For starters, the stories that become the focus of the moral panic have to seem a little ridiculous, maybe even laughable. They have to be absurd, but they need to be clearly shown as dangerous nonetheless, society-threatening even. And it helps if it seems like they're backed by a large system of money, influence, and power. For our current moral panic, the term woke often becomes the point where all these narratives coalesce. Woke is a great word because you can apply it to pretty much whatever you want. If the M&Ms aren't smoking hot anymore, it's because of woke ideology. If a balloon doesn't get shot down fast enough, it's because of woke bureaucrats. And if any movie or video game dares to feature someone who doesn't look like their ancestors ate, drank, lived, and breathed potatoes, it might as well not exist. Woke is a catch-all, under which you can fit the most ridiculous, insignificant story and the most important mass mobilizations against discrimination of our century haphazardly. Everything can be brought under the same roof and seem like it's all contributing to the same apocalyptic, dystopian destruction of humanity, even when nothing is happening but a reasonable demand for equality, inclusion, and safety. Woke serves as the bridge into every slippery slope fallacy, and is the word that takes any topic and makes it dystopian. Just look at that Tucker Carlson clip again where he says, "This is everywhere."
Once again, this is everywhere.
The Chiron reads, "Children's hospitals are sexually mutilating kids." The graphic has free speech in a Ghostbusters stamp. And Tucker is literally saying, "This is everywhere." That shot is just a grab bag of whatever he thinks will inflame the panic of his audience. And he's not alone. Elon Musk has taken this a step further, calling wokeness a mind virus and a mortal threat to civilization a million times on Twitter. And in a segment that ends on the idiotic simplification that those on the left think biology is a theory, Bill Maher spends an agonizing 7 minutes pontificating about there being such a thing as a woke revolution that will spin out of control over a Chiron that reads, "Purge overkill." It's almost unbelievable that anyone takes these dorks seriously, but millions of people do. And through a barrage of news stories, TV segments, and TikToks, every day in the US, millions of people are associating a supposedly totalizing threat to civilization with the existence of queer people who they believe to be abusing children and indoctrinating them, as if being gay or trans is something you're recruited into. Let me be clear, it's not. Conservatives panic at every slight increase in the number of people who identify as LGBTQ and jump to the conclusion that there is some sort of mass recruitment effort, when the reality is that a greater societal acceptance has just made it safer to come out than before. The same thing happened with left-handedness. Once the stigma dissipated and being left-handed stopped being punished so severely, more people started being left-handed all of a sudden, and no one was accusing left-handed teachers funded by the left-handed scissor lobby of indoctrinating all these kids, because that would be ridiculous. But we haven't gotten to the part where this turns into violence yet. We have the foundation, an association between queerness and grooming, and the association of those two things with wokeness, making it a civilization-ending threat. Now, we can bring in the vigilantes.
Right now at 6, drag queen story time interrupted at an East Bay library. A hate crime investigation now underway.
Like I mentioned earlier, an increase in targeted and demonizing rhetoric is associated with a rise in hate crimes in a statistically significant way. And the same can be said of more extreme events like shootings. Once the groundwork has been laid, that basically any queer person can be considered guilty until proven innocent, and part of a plot that could literally end civilization, only two things are left to do. One, convince your audience that this goes all the way to the top, and therefore that the government, generally speaking, won't be there to stop it. And two, that it is therefore your responsibility to intervene, often in explicitly violent terms. The first is easy enough. As soon as someone like Biden calls out the increase in violence against the LGBT community and the increase in anti-LGBT rhetoric, conservative media will portray him as protecting groomers.
Does the Biden administration even know that American students can't do math anymore? We just saw the biggest drop of all time in math scores for 4th and 8th graders across the country. The Democrats closed the schools down and told all the students they were racists who needed sex changes. I wonder why they're failing algebra. It's almost like they want our children dumb and guilty and confused.
For an audience susceptible to QAnon-style conspiracies, it's not hard to guess what an open-ended statement like that might evoke. Basically, Democrats won't be there to protect kids, so what is left to do?
You shouldn't be talking to kindergartners about gender identity, especially if you're not their parents. That's creepy. You should be arrested for that, in fact. You talk to a normal person's kids about sex in kindergarten, you get beaten up. You should be beaten up. Please.
If I was a parent and my 5th grade daughter had to sleep and shower in some kind of cabin at some summer camp that I paid money to send my child to, and there was a man calling himself a woman sleeping in her cabin, showering with her, that guy he'd be in jail. He would be in jail. Well, first off, my husband would have beat him into the ground, and then he'd be in jail. But this is exactly how we need to stand up against this.
No one should put up with this. No parent should put up with this for 1 second, no matter what the law says. Your duty, your moral duty, is to defend your children. This is an attack on your children, and you should fight back.
We can't just stand idly by while woke ideology ravages every institution in our society. We must fight the woke in our schools. We must fight the woke in our businesses.
When you put it all together, the consequence is obvious. It's stochastic terrorism. Acts of terrorism that are incited by the public demonization of a person or group and that cannot be predicted in detail, but are statistically highly probable. For millions of Americans, this kind of narrative will only have a small and personal effect. They will come to despise, or at the very least distrust, the LGBTQ community, and it will have almost no effect on their lives or the lives of those around them. For millions of others, this will turn into something they use as the basis for harassing queer people they see in their lives or supporting candidates who promise to punish them. And invariably, for someone in the crowd, this is the call to action they need. The media figures they trust are telling them that there is a problem, that it is widespread, underground, and that it has the potential to destroy society. The government isn't doing anything to stop it. In fact, it's actively promoting it. And these same media figures they trust have just given them the green light to fight back, to make their home state the place where woke goes to die. They are begging for someone to go and beat people up. So eventually, somebody will. And you get shootings, and you get hate crimes, and armed far-right militias showing up at brunches to intimidate regular people back into the closet. Built into this model is plausible deniability. The call to action was never explicit. The specifics of the act of terror could not be predicted. But what other conclusion could be arrived at? How could hours upon hours of primetime television be devoted to this topic in these specific and dystopian terms without acts of terror happening? What else do these pundits expect? With this rhetoric, stochastic terrorism is inevitable, and they know it. The title of this video has the word fascism in it, and I want to address that as we wrap up. This groomer panic absolutely has to do with fascism. For one thing, a lot of the narratives used in the groomer panic map perfectly to those embraced by the fascist right throughout history. The classic fascist narrative is always about a once great society presently in a state of decline at the hands of an internal threat. In our case, the US needs to be made great again, and is under threat by woke ideology promoted by LGBT parents and teachers. These enemies are always aided by the socialist left, hence the attention to woke leftists in our current groomer panic. And the state is almost always depicted as simultaneously ineffectual and in cahoots with the conspiracy. The reason that this panic excites these same triggers is that heteronormativity, white supremacy, and the nuclear family are the foundations of the society fascists wish to uphold. All are brought into question by the acceptance of the LGBTQ community and the increased visibility and contesting of racism. This reckoning is therefore viewed by the far right as destabilizing, and thus it demands violent retaliation in order to protect the nation, in this case embodied by the next generation, and these principles of white supremacy, heteronormativity, and the nuclear family. But it's more than just a similar narrative. This moral panic has mobilized literal fascists. Whether or not you personally consider this moral panic to have anything to do with fascism, fascists do. In response to this groomer narrative, far-right militias have assumed a sort of vigilante role and are intimidating those targeted by the rhetoric, showing up armed to drag brunches, reading groups, and various pride events, causing many to shut down and getting more and more people to fear for their lives. So-called lone wolves with far-right beliefs are also a part of that equation. Less organized, but equally culpable in making LGBTQ spaces less safe and going beyond just threats. And if that wasn't enough, it's not just militias or individual actors participating in this effort. In Florida especially, but increasingly all over the country, state power has been marshaled to enact more and more policing of the LGBTQ community to complement what militias and lone wolves are doing. And if a shared narrative and the literal involvement of fascists weren't enough for you, there is an almost one-to-one Nazi analogy to link fascism with the current groomer panic. In Nazi Germany, the terms Jugendverführer and Jugendverderber, meaning seducer and corrupter of youth respectively, were used by the Nazis to demonize queer people. According to one historian, this trope depicted, quote, a uniquely dangerous figure who lured normal young men into depravity, and thus spread the epidemic of homosexuality. A lot of commonalities there already, but let's read a little further. In 1934, the rumor that homosexual cliques planned to seize power took hold, giving homosexuals another identity as enemies of the state. And as you can probably already predict, the wave of persecution that followed was dramatic and deeply animated by this rhetoric, and became one of the many tools that Nazi fascists used to develop their policing power. Queer people were sent to concentration camps wearing this pink upside-down triangle. They were imprisoned, and all manner of other sorts of violence were used by the Nazi Party and their sympathizers to stamp out of German society a so-called homosexual personality. Like today, the goal was not to eliminate all LGBT people, but to make their visible presence unacceptable by brutal violence, so that those who ever exhibited any trace of queer behavior, whatever that means, could be ruthlessly targeted. If you somehow don't feel concerned by this horrifying moment we're living in, consider this. Fascism requires an outgroup on which to pin the blame for all of society's woes. If tomorrow the narrative of trans grooming becomes ineffective, either because their repression will have become so totalizing or because the public will have moved on, there are plenty of other people left under the woke umbrella for the far right to focus its efforts on. It has proven it can be mobilized by this rhetoric into acts of violence. There is little reason to believe it won't be mobilized again against someone else it considers to be part of the threat on Western civilization. The rest of the LGBTQ community could be first up on the list, but attention could equally quickly shift to immigrants, socialists, Black Americans, non-traditional women, and the list can go on forever. Woke can mean roughly anything, and can be made infinitely dystopian, so anyone on the left of Tucker Carlson and any group resisting established modes of persecution can become a target. Fascism has rarely ever appeared fully formed. It takes time for the apparatus of evil to gain critical momentum. But we are already seeing its symptoms, and many people are already feeling the jackboot. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my other videos by following the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. Here's a parliament building being shelled by its president. Here's a starving Russian. And here's Mikhail Gorbachev with a big old pizza pie. This week, we're talking about liberal shock therapy.
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
This is the USSR. Back in the 20th century, the USSR was a country. Now, not so much. And the history of this transition has typically been told one specific way. As you probably already know, in the West, the end of the USSR is a story of inevitable triumph, a sort of teleological proof of the superiority of capitalism and the definitive nail in the coffin for any kind of socialist project. You'll certainly have experienced this yourself, but all over America and in Western countries in general, people are taught pretty early on about events like the fall of the Berlin Wall or Reagan's speech by the Brandenburg Gate. From these moments, the story goes, came the inevitable end of the USSR, of the Cold War, and to some, even of history itself. The story is usually told as though it couldn't have gone any other way. Capitalism was always going to win in the end. It's a very Marvel movie kind of way to tell history. For most people, then, the period following the dissolution of the USSR has been folded neatly into the US's overarching narrative for the 20th and 21st centuries. It's a narrative of manifest destiny, where the US is the vanguard of democracy for the rest of the world and extends freedom and peace and justice benevolently to all who suffer under the yoke of tyranny. In this narrative, there is democracy on one side and communism on the other. And the US prides itself on bringing democracy everywhere it goes, including in Russia. But as you can probably expect from all the other times the US has quote unquote brought freedom and democracy to other countries, that whole narrative doesn't really line up with what actually happened. The end of the Soviet Union was not the arrival of democracy to the former Soviet countries. Russian capitalism was not the product of a democratic reawakening, and it was certainly not inevitable. The whole transition period between the Soviet era of Russia to its modern capitalist iteration was, in reality, a time of brutally anti-democratic violence, massive and immediate misery for millions, and the beginning of a new period of insecurity. And it all started with a process called shock therapy. As you might already know, in economics, shock therapy is the process of suddenly transitioning from a planned economy to a capitalist economy. Said differently, shock therapy is the abrupt, simultaneous, and top-down implementation of multiple capitalist economic principles where they once did not exist. The kinds of policies implemented are usually centered around your typical capitalist stuff like privatizations, as well as things like removing price controls, opening the domestic economy to international capital, and of course, austerity politics. The goal of shock therapy is to bring in rugged, quote-unquote, free-market, neoliberal capitalism quickly and at pretty much any cost. It's called shock therapy by its advocates to try to evoke a positive, almost medical notion of economic transition. Something like ripping off a Band-Aid. A little shock at first, but an overall therapeutic outcome in the end. In reality, though, shock therapy is about as gentle and medical as a bath with a toaster, and it can hardly be said to have cured any of the countries where it's been implemented. But that's not all. The term shock therapy has more recently come to have a sort of double meaning. Not only does the shock part of shock therapy evoke the sudden pace of change and the electric violence of the whole process, as we've already covered, it also captures the, let's say, convenient use of shocking events to push capitalism through at breakneck speed. In the words of Naomi Klein, shock therapy is the brutal tactic of using the public's disorientation following a collective shock, wars, coups, terrorist attacks, market crashes, or natural disasters, to push through radical pro-corporate measures. So, what did all this look like in Russia? For starters, in order to bring shock therapy to Russia, the idea of democracy had to be severely, let's say, reinterpreted. Following a wave of liberalization under the last president of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the continuing effects of the Cold War, the USSR was suddenly, illegally, and undemocratically dissolved from within. Boris Yeltsin, then president of Russia, a republic within the USSR, signed an accord with the heads of two other Soviet republics to mutually recognize each other's independence. The leaders of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia all sat at a table, called themselves and each other independent countries, and then they just were. At the end of the day, to be a country, you really only need to say you are and find another country to agree with you. Just like that, the Soviet Union was functionally over, since without the U, that was pretty much it for the SSR. A couple weeks later, then, Gorbachev resigned as leader of the USSR, and the Supreme Soviet, the equivalent of a parliament or a congress, announced the formal dissolution of the Union. I summarized that pretty quickly, and that's partly because things happened really fast in real life, too. The sudden dissolution of the USSR really caught Soviet citizens by surprise, since just a couple months earlier, the USSR had held a countrywide referendum in which 80% of the population voted overwhelmingly in favor of preserving the Union, with some reforms to how it would function. Close to 80% of Soviet citizens wanted to keep the USSR around, including large majorities in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, the same countries that would announce their independence. In other words, the dissolution was not the fruit of some democratic process, it just kind of happened. One day the USSR was unified, then it was multiple countries, and then it stopped existing. What was left in its wake was a cluster of nations and, most importantly for this video, the new Russian Federation, led by liberal, capitalist, and nationalist president Boris Yeltsin. To be clear, this summary skips so many important events, but this video is about liberal shock therapy, not the dissolution of the USSR, so we gotta keep moving. And speaking of, keep moving is exactly what the Russian Federation did. Using the shock of the sudden collapse of the USSR, Yeltsin began pushing through more capitalist reforms in the newly born Russian Federation. He brought in capitalist institutions like the IMF, as well as capitalist economists like Jeffrey Sachs, more on him later, to help radically transform the Russian economy with the goal of bringing neoliberal capitalism in fast. And it started very early. The final month of the USSR's existence was December 1991, and by January of 1992, shock therapy was unleashed. First, price controls on consumer goods were dropped almost entirely, leading to an immediate 250% increase in price of basic necessities. Then came the layoffs and the hyperinflation. Unemployment skyrocketed by 56%. GDP fell 14.5% in a single year. Industrial production declined by almost 20%. Inflation ballooned to a ridiculous 1,354%, and real incomes were cut in half. The government cut spending on education and health, and between 1989 and 2002, deaths increased by 12.8%, and life expectancy for men declined by a full 6 years between 1991 and 1994. For reference, the drop in life expectancy due to COVID is about 1 year in the US. But that's not all. According to Tony Wood, an author on the transition to modern Russia, the ILO classified 85% of Russia's citizens as under the poverty line in 1992, which the Yeltsin government swiftly corrected, quote unquote, to a teeny tiny 35%, or in other words, 1 in 3 people. And all of this, mind you, after the USSR stopped being at war with the world's largest economic and military power. This humanitarian crisis happened not during a violent, paralyzing war, but during a time of relatively unprecedented peace for Russia. These reforms and crises were accompanied with a decree from Yeltsin allowing anyone to sell anything at any time with no permit anywhere in Russia, prompting recently impoverished Russians to fill the streets in makeshift bazaars selling family heirlooms, personal belongings, and really anything they could to make ends meet. Perversely, this was commented on by Jeffrey Sachs, the economist leading the shock therapy project in Russia, as evidence of spontaneous market activity, as though people were being good little capitalists and not desperately trying to salvage what they could to stave off hunger. Unsurprisingly, as a consequence of this whole mess, organized crime found a welcoming home in the chaotic and deregulated environment of capitalist transition, leading, according to multiple accounts, to the development of the Russian mafia. But still, that's not all. We haven't even gotten to the privatizations. In 1992 alone, 47,000 state companies were privatized, a number that nearly doubled to 90,000 by the end of the following year. Companies formerly integrated into the planned economy were cut up into shares and offered for sale to the Russian people. Well, that is, in theory. Unsurprisingly, this process was done in a quick and dirty way that completely screwed over Russian people immediately. To privatize the economy, Soviet industries within the planned economy were available for purchase in shares. Russians would receive a voucher worth about $20, with which they could technically buy shares in privatized companies, or if they wanted, they could just resell them. As common sense would suggest, when you're starving, a share isn't worth as much as cash. But regardless of what Russians did with these vouchers, it was almost always a losing investment. Behind Yeltsin's rhetoric of creating a society of, quote, millions of owners was the reality that Russian capitalism was being built to look like every other capitalism, top-heavy, like a shampoo bottle, like when you flip it over to get that last little bit of shampoo from the bottom by getting it to the top. You already know what top-heavy means. I don't know why I felt like making an analogy. In any case, only 14% of companies privatized during the transitional period were ever available at public auction or for public stock purchase. Most privatizations went to insiders, or company managers, people who could take advantage of the new capitalist system effectively. Thus, in a very short amount of time, Russian capitalism caught up with its peers, with wealth concentrating at the top of society and inequality following the same trajectory. This, by the way, is what created the Russian oligarchy we know today. And here I'll pause for a second, because it might seem like this whole spiel is evidence of some sort of bureaucratic inefficiency, or simple corruption, or that neoliberal economists had good intentions but made a mistake in their execution. That in theory, this process could have happened in some fair and productive way. But no, it couldn't have. One, even if privatizations had been coordinated fairly, it wouldn't have mattered. Capitalism naturally tends towards the concentration of money at the top, regardless of if there's a fair starting point. The oligarchy we all know and love would have shown up. It might have just taken a bit longer. Two, the reality is that privatization was sloppy and corrupt not by some accident, but because neoliberal economists wanted it to be. Shock therapists wanted privatization to happen fast, before anyone could stop it, and sloppiness was just part of the deal. Jeffrey Sachs put it extremely clearly when in 1993 he wrote, quote, "As early advisors on the privatization process, we argued strongly for speed above perfection in the distribution of shares. For the general success of the reforms, which were extremely precarious from the start, it was important to make facts by establishing widespread private property rights. If that meant heavy insider representation, that was a cost that should be accepted." Fun fact, here's a quote from 2012 where he denies ever saying this. So why did neoliberals like Sachs care so little about quote-unquote perfection and care so much about speed? Because they all knew that if this process didn't happen immediately, it would not pass democratic muster. Here's another Sachs quote where he pretty much says that out loud. But more convincing proof of this disregard for, and even fear of, democracy than what Sachs said is what the IMF and Boris Yeltsin actually did. For starters, the IMF did what the IMF has always done. After giving its recommendations for how to restructure the economy, meaning gutting it and letting capitalists strip it to pieces, the IMF withheld crucially necessary funds until those neoliberal reforms went through. I don't think it's being a wacky political extremist to say that an international organization paying for a country to change their economy is maybe not the most democratic process, but maybe that's just me. IMF and American pressure notwithstanding, in order to bring about the full and rapid transition to a capitalist economy that shock therapy required, Yeltsin also had to brute force his reforms, which he did by rapidly consolidating power in the executive branch of the Russian government. Over the course of the early 90s, Yeltsin would increasingly rule without Russian parliament in a series of constitutional changes and periods of exceptional power, something that made the parliament a little upset, and which Yeltsin acknowledged by, let me check my notes. Oh, right. Ordering the army to shell the shit out of him in 1993. Again, I'm no democracy expert here, but maybe this is not really what democracy is about. This also doesn't feel very invisible hand to me. Just a thought. And all this is setting aside the massive advantages Yeltsin got in preserving his presidential powers thanks to Russia's privatized press institutions, which turned an 8% approval rating into a successful presidential victory thanks to more time on television and more favorable coverage, as well as all the electoral rigging. Ultimately, though, some devil's advocate type could justify these brutal interpretations of bringing democracy to the east with some sort of